What's going on, everybody? Thanks for tuning in with me on Modern Soccer Coach Podcast. And if you're checking this out after the fact, thanks for catching up. And this video is going to be looking at Chelsea, comparing their build-up with Manchester City build-up ahead of the Champions League final. And in this video, we're going to be looking at some asymmetries, some similarities and differences within these asymmetries of each team's build-up, and primarily focusing on the first and second third of the field for both teams, and primarily looking at their first and second line of their build-up shape and looking to describe their team structure from their bases of the first and second line. So before we start, we have to acknowledge the variability within the Manchester City first and second line, whereas Chelsea, they are more set in their structure. Ever since Tuchel took over the job, they went with 3 central defenders and a double pivot, and now as they start to get used to the structure, start to adopt the roles, and the players grow into the roles that Tuchel has put in place for them, we're starting to see the qualities of the players a little bit more. For example, Conte playing as the second holding midfielder along Jorginho, he's been playing more as an 8 with more license to get forward, which makes sense because of his ability to cover ground and his athletic qualities. Puts him closer, higher up the field with a loss of possession, leads to more ball recoveries in advanced areas, making them more dangerous. But let's get right into it with the Manchester City team. So the first of which, I suspect Manchester City will go with 2 central defenders, 2 natural central defenders, as that's been their most common function within their structure. Looking at their double pivot, they will create a double pivot in some way, shape, or form, most likely against Chelsea, to give them more structure in possession and more control in transition, because Chelsea do look dangerous and they have the players to hurt Man City in transition, especially if they go with 2 natural central defenders, then creating a back 3 via a rotation or asymmetric movement of some sort. And we're going to be talking a lot about asymmetries in this video because that directly relates to my book, which is out. You can check it out. There's a link below in the description. So we're going to try to be relating these concepts back to the book I wrote. In this first picture, we have our 2 central defenders being split by the goalkeeper. And now one similarity we'll notice is the staggering of the double pivot and the ability for these players to occupy different vertical and horizontal lines. And now what this does, it creates different situations for the defense to have to defend against. So on one side, we'll see the right central defender most of the time will be Ruben Diaz. He'll then have a mutual help space option, which will look quite like a rondo. So he'll have 3 passing options, a first, second, and third line passing option, which is a very fundamental way Manchester City look to exploit numerical superiority with players on different lines and maximum diagonal passing options. Whereas on the weak side, the third line passing option will be created a little bit higher up the field, and there'll be a lower density or lower numerical occupation of the wide area and the half space, which will then elicit more for a mid-range pass to then beat the press directly, taking advantage of the goalkeeper's range of passing. So now moving into the midfield third, I thought it was really interesting in their FA Cup match. Manchester City did things very differently, but this is crucial when looking at similarities and differences of Chelsea and Man City, because where Manchester City, they have the license to change structure and manipulate the space and the occupation of space to then lead to different routes of progression. Chelsea don't have quite that variability within their team, which may help them in simplifying player roles and being consistent with how they play every game. And maybe it's why they've been so consistent under Thomas Tuchel this season, ever since he took over. But with Manchester City, if they go with a back 4, there'll be some key differences, and this might just be situationally. They might line up on paper with a back 3, back 5, but at some point in the game, Manchester City will look like they have 2 central defenders. In every game, they rotate through structures and player positionings, so it's not uncommon to find them with a back 4 and then having a 3-man first line build-up structure. But when they do go with 2 central defenders and their double pivot, it completely changes where the space is and how they look to occupy this space. So the first thing is both teams share as principles is the staggering of their first and second line in their build-up shape. Now the staggering is crucial for the teams, and they couldn't grind out results like they have been doing either side all season without this staggering. So what I mean by this is that the staggering from the central defenders into the holding midfielders and the fullbacks are on diagonal passing options, which puts natural passing lanes between defenders because of this staggering, and it makes it harder for them to block these passes with their cover shadow. And now we start to see a little bit of symmetry with how they occupy the half space and wide area on either side. Now, it's important to note with each of the central defenders more oriented towards the half space, it elicits more of a two-man first line build-up structure. And with pressure mounting, the double pivot is a way they can secure ball possession, and with the goalie at a base, they always have a fail-safe if things go south. Much like Chelsea aren't afraid to use their goalkeeper, although they do it more sparingly than Manchester City. But with the two-man first line build-up and the four-man second line build-up, Manchester City would then look to exploit space in the wider area. And another similarity is the occupation of the wide area of these two teams. Now, Chelsea do it with wing backs advancing further up the field, whereas City, more often than not, they use single occupation of the wide area, unless, as we see here, they use their fullbacks and have their wingers enter the wide area, but a little bit more narrow, always having one wider than the other in the same vertical channel in the wide area. But when they do use double width, it's usually to disconnect the defense horizontally, where Chelsea, they go with single width more often than not, except when Timo Werner pulls into the wide area. And they do this to hold their structure to create space for the players in the central positions. Now looking at City with a three-man build-up structure, we have our back three and a single pivot now. And this is what we should expect to see more in the Champions League final between the two teams. Three players in the build-up as each team will use. Because of the security, it gives each team in possession, and it gives the opportunity for more fluid movements higher up the field. So as we see here, as we've seen Cancelo more often than not this season, he's been going in to inverted roles or along the single pivot, who's more often than not Rodri. And then this allows the attacking midfielders to occupy space higher up the field between the lines and create numerical superiority over teams with a five-man midfield structure. And the five-man comes from the two holding midfielders, the two offensive midfielders, a little bit wider, again creating the diagonality, which is a staple in each team's offensive structure, and the fifth player will usually be the false nine coming from a higher area, as we see here. And now we're not talking specifically about players in higher areas, but with talking about the similarity of each team going with a back three in possession. Chelsea, they typically go with a 3 or 5 man defensive structure out of possession, which will present Pep with the problem of how do we pin these players, or do we try and get them to jump to deeper players and exploit the space in behind. So two forwards would pretty typically pin 3 central defenders, but it's all personal preference and how Pep wants to exploit and create space in the first and second line to then progress the ball. So now going back to the FA Cup final where they had the double pivot of Fernandinho and Rodri, we look to see how, even though they're playing with a clear back four on paper with the personnel and how the game developed, we'll still see the use of a 3-man back line in their offensive phase. And this gives them passing options from each of the central corridors, both half spaces and the central area. And another key similarity is the use of the central corridors, but not only the central corridors, but also the wide area with their back three. So we may even see whether it's John Stones, Diaz, or Laporte entering just the wide area, to then have more space to then take its first touch forward and progress around the Chelsea defensive block, especially because they do defend quite narrow. And whereas in this situation it's Laporte, Chelsea it would be Rudiger, and they play very similar roles in possession with their aggressiveness and confidence to drive forward, progressing around the opposing team's defensive block. And on this weak side, Man City more often than not will create this back three with an asymmetric back four, seeing Kyle Walker come as the right central defender in the wide area in a deeper position alongside the front three, using asymmetry in terms of horizontal distance between these players. And then a single pivot. As we see, each team will always have a pivot, whether it's a single or a double will vary very much for each team. Another similarity with Jorginho playing the role for Chelsea and Rodri playing this role for City. Both Rodri and Jorginho will pretty much be the main pivot, but then we have Conte and Kovacic on Chelsea playing more as an 8, but also occupying the double pivot role in possession, but with license to jump forward into offensive positions, whereas City, they use more horizontal movements from Cancelo to then enter alongside Rodri, or Gundogan coming from a higher area into a deeper area to form this double pivot. So now Chelsea in possession. In the first third, they'll use asymmetry within their goalkeeper, Kepa. Usually Thiago Silva goes to the right of Kepa to then overload the right side, which is, as we talked about earlier in the video, is a staple for Manchester City as well. The ability to overload one side, vacate the weak side, and then have different routes of progression depending on the side. And we just start to see the staggering from the double pivot. Jorginho playing deeper pretty much all the time, connecting play from the first, second, and third line, and stabilizing, consolidating possession as his role, with his qualities of being able to handle a high volume of passes and ball retentions played into him. Conte playing through the right half space primarily. He'll pretty much always play through the right half space, and a difference between the double pivot of City and Chelsea is the Chelsea double pivot will play more off-centered, meaning Jorginho will play in the central corridor and Conte will play more in the half space. And what this does is it gives Conte a little bit less pressure because his technical ability isn't his biggest strength. But with him playing the half space, it gives him less of a chance to be back pressed and gives him an easier time with his field of view on where he can look, and limiting the amount of options he has, making it good for him because it simplifies his decision-making process. So now Chelsea again, we're looking now in the Premier League match between these two teams, clear back three, a pretty symmetric back three as we'll typically see from Chelsea. But don't be surprised if Reece James plays in this role and plays it a little bit wider to then be more aggressive with his dribbling progression into past the first and second line of pressure. And now the double pivot of Chelsea, and we can talk about staggering from both teams as a similarity, pretty much playing off-centered from each of the defensive players, creating press-resistant structures around the Manchester City defensive shape, which will be crucial in their match to exploit the third man concepts, as we just see here off our screen, the fullback of Chelsea. And where they can really hurt City is when City press out to in, meaning using their cover shadow to block these passes into the wider areas. Chelsea can use this to exploit a third man concept and create press-resistant structures through the central corridors to then find this free player in the wider area. Now, with Chelsea, how the first and second line impact the players higher up the field will be less intense than how Manchester City's team do it, but they'll pretty much will more, I can more than guarantee each team will use their double pivot at some point in the game and use the occupation overload the half space, creating a base within the half space, the double pivot, staggering themselves to utilize the half space and creating height through the half space. And all these players will be a little bit off-centered to avoid vertical passes, but also changing their height to ask different questions of the Manchester City defense. And where Manchester City have natural wingers that occupy wider areas like Phil Foden often does to then come more narrow, we see the wingbacks of Chelsea more often than not will play in the wider areas as more traditional wingbacks. Both of them are highlighted here, but sparingly will they come in and make inverted runs. So if we see Azpilicueta or Reece James, whoever plays this role, he will oftentimes make narrow runs between defenders, which will then free up space for the third line passing option, which we haven't talked about much, but that's the offensive midfielder to come unmarked and preventing a defender of the Manchester City defensive line from jumping and following him, allowing players like Pulisic, Ziyech, Timo Werner even though his strength isn't with his back to goal, but these players arriving the blind side of the holding midfielders of Manchester City to then have an outlet in possession of the ball. And those are just a few concepts when looking at both of the teams. Similarity, differences, talking about asymmetry, talking about changes in structure, players' tendencies and how their qualities impact their roles. And it should be an exciting game. I can't wait. And that's the video, guys. Hope you enjoyed it.